We'll call the meeting to order at 6:02. Stephanie, could you take attendance?
Yep, Peggy Beisel. Finding her mute button.
Using my son's computer tonight too, so it's a whole new game for me. I'm here.
Wave in your attendance.
Brian Davis.
Here.
Lisa Hadeen.
Here.
Scott Gergen.
Here.
Dave Pemble.
Present.
Stephanie Mullen here, and Kelsey Waits.
Here. All right. So first up is approval of our agenda, and we did have a last minute addition put in today just so that no one is surprised, and it's down in the items for individual action, the internet upgrade project.
Yeah, and just so we're clear on that one, my apologies for not catching it sooner, but it's part of an E-rate thing that we need to get done, and we do need board approval because of the dollar amount, and so we can talk about it later, but just I wanted to give you a heads up so you don't hear it for the first time on the agenda. But it's for all of our switches and our internet hotspots that are a part of the bond project. So I don't want to be having any of that bidding done without the board approving that stuff. So
Yeah, so I just wanted to draw attention to that before we approved it, so that in case you hadn't caught that there was a change. So with that, do we have a motion to approve the agenda?
So move.
Second.
Any discussion? All right, all those in favor say aye.
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 Aye. Opposed, same sign. All right, motion carries. Next up is the approval of the minutes from the January 27th regular board meeting. Do we have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second.
Is there any discussion? Okay, all those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed, same sign. All right, motion carries. So, I don't know why my board book is acting funny right now. I'd just like to recognize all the visitors who are watching from home, and thank you for participating in the board meeting, and we're glad you're here. So announcements and recognitions.
Yeah, so I do want to take a moment. Normally we take this time to recognize, students or faculty, staff, but this week is school board recognition week. And so I do want to take this time to let the public know that this week was designated by the Minnesota School Boards Associations as School Board Recognition Week. And such, I'd like to thank each of the 7 of you for the time and energy you put into your elected roles. I know the audience watching sees our school board once or twice per month. However, there is a lot that goes on in between meetings. Board members are working on policies, attending committee meetings such as facilities or finance, attending training sessions put on by MSBA, and attending meetings as representatives of our district. In addition, at various times, our school board takes time to volunteer with things like our meal programs, childcare. They work sporting events, connect with our community, and work to understand what is most important for our families and our students. So on behalf of our Raider staff, I do want to personally thank each of you for every moment you put into making Independent School District 200 an excellent school district. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bob.
You get 1 person clapping.
Thank you.
Thank you for the kind words, Bob.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. So then with that, we will move on to our items for discussion tonight, beginning with policies. So first up for our first reading is policy 421, which is gifts to employees and school board members. And so if you look on our website, there's actually an issue with this policy where policy 421 and 430 are the same policy, and this policy is missing. So this is us trying to put in the appropriate policy for policy 421. And this is actually taken from MSBA's model policy.
And this is also a policy that Kathy Moen did some research with our legal team, and the recommendation was that the board adopt the policy as written by MSBA for this one.
So with that, are there any questions or concerns? Otherwise, we will be able to just move this to a second reading for next month. But not seeing anyone with questions. So, all right, this one will move along and we'll see it again in March. So we have a couple policies on for the second reading, beginning with policy 100, the equity policy. And so this is one that we've talked about at board meetings, both the regular board meeting and the work session, the previous work session. And so the policy committee met last week and we had a long discussion about whether this was most appropriate as its own policy or a statement, just as kind of we had heard some feedback from the board. And the committee agreed that it really wanted to bring this forward and recommend to the board that this be brought on as a standalone policy. And there were some significant adjustments made to the policy to work on it so that it would read more like a policy and less of a statement. So with that, are there any questions or comments?
Well, just for the sake of consistency, I'll remake the points I've made in the past, which is I still don't think this is the way to go forward, and that may be reflected in my vote when the time comes, because I can certainly read the writing on the wall that this is happening. I also have a concern as I looked forward at the policy committee's notes from the meeting, and I see a couple of other policies got backburnered until the end of the strategic planning process. And I look at this, which clearly lists values. I mean, like super clearly, A, B, C, D lists values. And this isn't being backburnered for completion of the strategic planning, and it was developed by a relatively small group of staff and then run through policy. So process-wise, I'm not supportive of the way this came out. I'm certainly supportive of the intent. So that's my general overarching comment. Should it go forward? There's just a couple little language things. And right at the beginning, it says something like the school board believes. I think it's paragraph 2. I didn't write myself very good notes. I would feel a lot more comfortable if that was Hastings Public Schools. Because the board is an entity that changes over, and I'm not comfortable with it saying that. If it was going to say something, I feel like it's Hastings Public Schools. And then in paragraph 4E, and it's just the one place there's inconsistent use of language naming the school board. I think everywhere else in the policy it's called the school board, and then in 4E it's called ISD 200 something something. And so that's just a consistency of language point. Those are my only comments.
All right, thank you. Does anyone else have any comments or questions? I see your point as we go forward and we're looking at the policies and such and the strategic plan. And so one of the reasons, and we can talk about this when we do the policy update, as far as the strategic plan decision with the policies regarding graduation requirements. We can go into that more when we discuss the policy committee summary, but that is something that we're recommending we wait. And like I said, we can go into that more. And one of the reasons why this one we didn't want to wait was more because this could affect kind of some of the processes as we go through the strategic plan, that as we talked kind of at the last meeting, how this is really a framework for the district, that we wanted to get that framework in place as we move forward with lots of other things.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about the other policies during the policy update. My understanding is that this was a framework, like a philosophical framework, and that what I heard from the policy committee was it was going to be used to reference other policies. It was going to be used to backbone other policies, which I think is not quite the same thing. Is saying let's get this in place so that's in place for strategic planning. I think a strategic plan like builds this, articulates it, and then it, you know, moves to policy. So I think we got a little bit. I think we got a cart in front of the horse. Again, I'm not concerned as much with what it's about. I'm not opposed to what it's about. I'm opposed. I don't like the process, and I think that we got this close to strategic planning, and it should be better. We should be better aligned.
Do any other board members have comments? Dave?
Thanks. I guess I'm looking at this and still trying to, I guess my feeling about this is we should be looking and saying, yes, equity. What this policy is trying to say is really a statement, and that statement should be acknowledged at everything as a part of a mission statement or part of something on everything we do. And maybe we need to tweak 102 and put those together. And I just don't see having the two policies. To me, it's like, okay, we want to talk about equity and inclusion. We want all that, but we want this set up properly. And Lisa brings up a good point. It's like cutting out the foundation before you're putting in the building blocks, but we don't have the strategic plan laid out and in place, and then you put the block or put the brick on the foundation. So I think that's a real viable point that needs to be addressed. But I'd still like to see a statement that sets above everything else, that says, you know, hey, this is what we stand for. You know, policies are great, but sometimes, you know, how many policies do we have between the 100 series and the 900 series? And does everybody actually look at those and sign off on that every year as new employees come in, or employees are brought back in the same process? And, you know, are we actually training and making sure folks have all these policies down pat? The number of policies, you know, that gets to be a problem, because people can only handle so much. They need to know where the policies are at and what they mean and what they have to follow. But I still think it's more of a statement thing that needs to be above everything we do. And I'll let somebody
Right.
else talk.
Yeah, and I don't think that putting it in policy limits us from putting something like in a mission statement or having it be part of a mission statement. Now, one thing, Carrie Gore had just gone to a communications training. I can't remember the name of the organization. Superintendent McDowell, if you remember.
NSPRA.
NSPRA. And yeah, and they had told her that having the board put equity in a policy is one of their recommendations and one of the strongest things that a board can do right now, as a side note.
And to bring up, Dave, you bring up you know, we had discussed putting this into 102 with the equal opportunity. I was on board with that until we really started to dig into 102, and we felt that this particular policy, what we were looking to do with it, and the emphasis that it would get lost in 102. So that was our biggest concern, is that it would get lost in 102. And it really, they are two separate things. So you have the equal opportunity, which is basis of law. It is, you know, it's procedural. Whereas this is, yes, it's a statement. It's not a typical policy that we see, but it is something that, you know, I think we all stand by, regardless of you know, the nuances of where it's read in an actual policy versus, you know, a value statement. But to have that additional impact and to have it a separate piece from equal opportunity, we felt would place more emphasis. I don't know, Kelsey, or Brian too. We had a really great discussion about it in the policy committee meeting. And they may be able to elaborate a little bit further on why we decided not to do that. Because again, I was like, okay, you know, we can integrate it into 102, but then my mind was changed because it would, in my opinion, get lost.
Brian, did you want to add something?
Sorry, still fighting with mute. No, I'm still kind of absorbing the conversation, but I do agree that we determined that it needed to Kelsey's point, there can be an overarching piece to a statement that can be part of a mission statement or anything. But again, when people go through and they look at the school in terms of what are the rules, what are the procedures, all those types of things, it's part of the policies. And we wanted to make sure that there was something there that they could reflect upon and know that it's part of what our expectations are of their students. And that's why we thought it was important to set it this way, as opposed to just being a statement and not being part of the policy.
Yep. We discussed tacking it on to be almost like a 102.1, an addendum to policy 102. But then as we discussed it, and we kept coming back to that idea of a framework that I guess Scott had brought up at the work session, that was kind of how he had viewed this, and that's kind of how we had been viewing it, and that there was this idea that setting it as policy 100, which would really be our first policy, then it was really setting the framework for the rest of the policies that follow. We thought that that was a more powerful way to make the statement rather than having it get lost as an addendum to policy 102. That being said, this is also an incredibly important policy. And so this is something that that having the board come together on this is far more powerful than a strongly split vote. And so we do, as a committee, really want to work with the board on how to make this something that we all come along with.
So I hear what you're saying with that, and I would agree that it makes us a different statement depending on the vote. I was trying to think of the right word in there. You know, where that comes out. I I appreciate, you know, I think we've had really respectful conversation as we've gone through this, and the differences seem procedural more than the heart of the message. I just haven't been swayed to the process piece, and as I see the policy committee making different recommendations for different types of policies, and I get it that they're, you know, like a values versus operational almost. Those are different, but it's hard for me to see the committee take different approaches to that with regard to strategic planning when this is such a primary element of our goals and statements and mission, I think. So.
Right, and
it's just hard for me to quite get there yet.
Right. And so one thing we have talked about as well is if this does get passed before the strategic plan, and if throughout the strategic plan we adjust our district value statements, that's an easy enough change to make in this policy later, because I don't think our district values will change significantly from what they are. Maybe I'm wrong. But that if there are adjustments to the policy or to our values after the strategic plan, that change can happen too. Scott?
Thank you. First, I think this document represents a big improvement over the last go round. So thank you for that. So just one thing, and that is just, I think that some of the wording in here needs to be cleaned up. The use of commas or lack of use of commas in some areas needs to be cleaned up. There's some sentences that are very, very long that I had to go back and reread like 3 times to understand exactly what they were going towards. Those are minor nitpicks. I'd like to shift just a little bit to understand, I'm looking at section 4, responsibility, to understand how some of these would be implemented. So let me just run through my thoughts, and there's going to be a few different things here to just, again, these are topics for that I seriously would like people's input on. So the first one, A, is that the school board shall consider the value stated in this policy in conducting our business and exercising our responsibilities to the people of the Hastings area. Absolutely. I can wrap my head around that. That makes sense. The school board, and B is the school board and superintendent may establish specific goals to implement this policy as permitted by law. I'm not quite sure what those goals would look like. So again, that's something that maybe we can talk about here. The superintendent shall establish, in accordance with this policy, such plans and procedures as may be necessary and appropriate to accomplish its purpose and intent. Plans and procedures established shall include clear accountability for actions and oversight and include metrics for evaluation. Again, what does that look like? Sliding down to district staff, again, they shall, within the parameters of their various duties and responsibilities, comply and execute such plans as are designed to address the values and directions included in this policy. So not the superintendent's establishing policies or values and directions included in this policy. Well, what does that look like? How do we, if I was a district staff person, I'd say, well, what am I supposed to be doing? You know, exactly, how is this going to be measured? How do I know that I'm doing what I should be? Sliding down a little bit further, oh, which one was it here that I thought was ripe for, here we are. Practices, procedures, and programs that result in over or under representation of any group of students compared to peers shall be subject to close review to assure that such results are due to meeting student legitimate educational, social, or emotional needs. Practices that do not meet this close review shall be eliminated. Okay, so in my mind, it's like, okay, so what groups of students are we speaking about? So I go back up to the top where it gives me a definition of diversity of race, culture, color, creed, religion, marital status, family structure, citizenship status, sexual orientation or affectional preference, national origin, biological sex, you know, mental and physical ability, age, gender identity or expression, economic status, military veteran status, any other class, any other protected class in conformance with federal, state, and local laws and ethnicity. So now using that definition and coming back down to this, I look at that and I say, okay, well, let's see. We have some pretty expensive things that happen at Hastings High School. So just an easy one would be economic status. So we have show choir, which is quite expensive. We have things like our international travel, which is quite expensive. Those are two standalone programs. We have things like choir and band and so forth that offer opportunities for travel with them. And I know not all students go on that. So how is that measured? I understand that in a lot of these programs that scholarships are available, just like they are available to cover sports fees and so forth. You know, sports could be another one. Look at hockey, look at, you know, some of the more expensive sports that we have. How do we measure that? And if we measure that, you know, for instance, if we say, you know what, and I'm picking on this one and I don't mean to, this is strictly just conversational, but it's one that I have experience with. So let's say the Greece and Italy trip. Well, it's been the Greece and Italy trip in the past. I don't think they're locked into that destination. So that is a very expensive trip, relatively speaking. I would say most people would agree that that is an expensive thing to do, that not all students have the opportunity to do. So using that metric of economic status in this case, does that mean that, okay, under scrutiny, that program shall be eliminated? So again, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but this is where my mind is going with this, to say, well, hold on a minute. Is this really, what do we really mean by this? And what is the implementation of some of this? Okay, because this is under the section called responsibility, meaning there's going to be action here. These are things that as a board, as a superintendent, as any district staff person, you are accountable for. You are responsible for these pieces. And I'm just wondering what that looks like. So
Superintendent McDowell.
So actually, Scott, I think those are awesome things to bring up with regard to this policy, because they hit on exactly what, not just the policy, but when someone would be to ask, what is equity work? That is exactly what we're talking about. And districts that have implemented either a policy or have decided we're gonna push everything we do, every decision we make through the filter of an equity lens. It may not be that we eliminate a program, but what we have and what the discussion that we have is one of, if it's that important for us to do or support, then we need to figure out either A, how do we get the opportunity for any student who wants to, regardless of any of those qualifying statements, to be able to participate in it, or we redesign it so that they can. And that goes for every program sports program, trip program, course program, whatever it is. That is exactly the purpose and intent of having an equity policy. And the metrics are exactly at that face value. Do all students, by the very nature of how we offer, implement, and work through a program, a whatever, do they all have access to it equally? And if not, I suppose on the extreme end, yeah, maybe it does go away. because the value statement, if there was a singular value statement that we're making is, if it's important to do, it's important for every student in our system to have access to do it. Otherwise, we better be asking ourselves whether it's important to do or whether we should be doing it, because then it isn't equitable. And
Right.
we're a public school system.
Sure. So even simple things like, okay, using the examples that I brought up, for instance, of show choir or of the Greece and Italy trip, they probably have limited space. Okay, you can't have a show choir of 1,200, right? You can't, there's not going to be a Greece and Italy trip of, the 400 students. That's probably not going to happen. So I'm again, a little bit of this is just playing devil's advocate, and I'm just making sure that people, myself included, are considering what this is leading to. And I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but this will lead to a reevaluation of everything that we do currently. And some of the outcomes might not be what you expect.
And so what I would say is, even with, say, a sports team, right? You're not going to have a basketball team that is every single student in the high school. And it's not about having every student do it. It's about having every student have an opportunity to try, right? That socioeconomic status is not going to leave someone out of participating in a program, that we're going to look at that program and figure out if there's a way to adjust it so that we're not leaving an entire group of kiddos out. And so the policy has us looking at these different programs and seeing where we see those gaps, right? We know that Minnesota has huge disparities, whether it's racial disparities or socioeconomic disparities. We are at the bottom of the list across the 50 states, and we have a lot of work to do. And if we recognize that these kids aren't any less smart, they're not any less deserving, that there's something with the system that keeps so many kids out and is adding to these disparities. And that's something that we can address through policy. It's the most powerful tool that a board has in order to try to bring something forward and make change, far more than a resolution or a statement, right? Policy holds us accountable. So.
Yep, I agree. And with that, I think we need to tread very thoughtfully as we choose to move forward. Again, I'm supportive of the ideas in this. We just need to be very thoughtful how we approach this.
Does anyone else have any comments? I'm not seeing any, but it does sound like, at least from what I'm hearing, that the board is not quite ready to pass this policy as it is. Is that what I'm hearing?
I'm hearing that as well, that we're getting closer and that we just need to clean up, taking a look at paragraph 2 or part 1, paragraph 2, making sure that there's consistency is the grammatical concerns, the verbiage, just tightening up that piece there too. Yeah, that's what I'm tracking.
Dave?
I think looking at what we've discussed so far and the items that need to be cleaned up in what we've seen in this rendition of Policy 100, I move that we table this and turn it back over to Policy Committee for another tune-up and send it back to us.
Yeah, and I don't believe we need a motion for that. It can just come back for a third reading after we've had another go at it.
I know that I brought up a lot of points when I was going through the responsibilities. I would like, as a board, I'd like to talk about what some of those actionable items that are meant, the superintendent shall do this, district staff shall do this. What does that really look like? What are we talking about there? Yeah, and then there was also statements in there that we would be supplying district staff with various opportunities for cultural, trainings and things such as that. Well, what does that look like? When do those take place? Is that, does that adjust our calendar, or where do these things occur?
Superintendent McDowell?
So I would just to that piece alone, I can appreciate the questions about that, but I would push it back up that the question for the board at the board level is one of, is offering, in that case, is offering staff training important to the board? And that's where the board leaves it, because if it is, then you vote yes. The how is my job. Is that policy gets put into place where the board says, we expect staff to be trained in this, whatever it is, doesn't even have to be this policy. The board has then given direction to me to figure that part out. And so it's a great question, but it's one of, after we have the policy in place, if you're not seeing what you're saying is, like, you're not seeing, we have this policy, I'm not seeing any evidence of it, what's going on? That's where the board comes into that question on any given policy.
Yeah, I appreciate that point, Superintendent McDowell. To jump off of what Scott was saying, and maybe this is another component of where this policy is getting closer to our policy standards. But even all of those responsibility statements, I mean, if we pass a policy as a board, superintendent is responsible to implement it, and we can all presume that superintendent is going to choose to use planning to implement it, right? And that they're going to choose to, and in this case, it's a little bit different in that we're trying to articulate that again, and maybe that's why it's a little bit another reason that it reads a little bit differently. But I was going to ask Scott, are you asking that rather than this going back to policy, that it becomes like a work session item, or where we're all sitting around the table at the same time? Well, a metaphorical table at the same time, talking about each item?
That wasn't where I was heading with that.
Okay.
I would be more than willing to noodle on that one a little bit, and is that a good idea? Is that a place that maybe we can work through some of this more completely as a board? What I don't want to have happen is have it keep going back and forth, between committee and then back to the board and then back to committee and back to the board. If I was on the committee, I think that would be a little frustrating, and I can certainly appreciate that.
Yeah, and I'm not saying it's a good idea to bring it to the whole board. I was just trying to understand what you were saying with that. And I, too, could see the frustration of it bouncing.
Well, it's just, if there's responsibilities in there, they need to be measurable, they need to be actionable, use the SMART acronym, right? Okay, we have to be able to do this. So training shall be offered. Okay, how often? Once a year? Once every 5 years?
But to stop you, I think that's where we're crossing over from governance to management. And so as a board, we can focus on, we want trainings to be put in place.
Mm-hmm.
The administration and Superintendent McDowell would determine, is that once per year? Is that twice per year? Is that every quarter? What does that look like? And that's in the management side versus what the board is approving with this policy.
But don't we want to lay out, if it's important enough to say that it should happen, is it important enough to say how often it should happen? So
I just think that's getting us too far into the weeds.
So if it happened once every 4 years, that's good. It happened, right? Meets the policy.
Those parameters would be set up by the administration. So Dr. McDowell and his staff would be the ones to implement the frequency. My assumption is that it would probably be yearly, like annual training, and upon necessity. So if there is an event that happens, such as the civil disturbance from last year, it may be a call for additional training. So it will be circumstantial, but I do anticipate that we would eventually see some sort of frequency of this training. But I would like to leave that to the administration.
Okay.
Just so you know, I've been through 30 hours of training in the last year and a half. So I would say the answer is as often as needed. The Wyeth had a lot of things they had to work on, and so it's been more often. If this district has a lot to work on, it's going to be more often, and Bob will figure that out. Bob and the administrators will figure out how often it needs to be. If they need to do it weekly, then we're going to find a way for them to do it weekly until they figure the heck out. And that, up to and including our own board. If we need work, we'll get work too. But those parameters, it's going to vary depending on how much is needed. And that's up to Bob and the administrators to figure out, from my perspective anyway.
One thing I would, sorry.
Oh, you're okay.
One thing I would throw out there, just as something to think about, Scott, hearing just about the noodling on it a little bit, right? Maybe it would be good to just take a step back and try to figure out as a board with this policy suggestion is the conversation that needs to be had about the topic of equity in the policy itself, or is there something about policy and procedure that also needs to be a conversation? And should that conversation be a discussion time at a board meeting, or a bigger discussion at maybe a work session or a retreat that's coming up or something like that, to clarify some of these points? Because to be honest, from my perspective, I'm not sure that I truly understand. I mean, I hear the concern of process, but what I flip around in my mind is that's a process thing independent of what's in the policy. So like Lisa, with your concern, I hear the process thing, but that's something to fix as a process discussion, no matter what the policy is, and whether we're behind or not behind what's in the policy is a different discussion. And then I hear Scott too with your with the pointing out there's cleanup in the policy, in this policy, and some questions about the policy specifically. But then I'm also hearing maybe it's something about in any given policy, to what degree do we create detail? And that those are just, that's what I'm hearing. I don't know. I guess it doesn't necessarily help for this policy where to go next with it, but I think I'm hearing remnants of two different conversations, and one is a global, doesn't matter what the policy is. It's a board, like, wow, what do we want to have this say no matter what the policy? And the other is a process thing. And then underneath that are the topic of the policy. Maybe that confuses the issue more, but.
No, I feel like your summary of what I've said was accurate. I think that's right. That it is a process piece, especially it's the only place that it bleeds over is that this is such a values oriented piece that it's hard for me to continue to get behind, advancing the policy when the process, I didn't buy into the process. But you're right, I think it's two different things. Two different conversations that I'm feeling about this.
I also want to say that throughout this discussion, I know that other boards have brought up similar policies across the state or across the country, and some of them have really blown up and gotten very, very disrespectful, and the board has just completely broken down. And I really appreciate how we as a board have discussions on these topics and talk through them. And anyway, School Board Appreciation Day. I appreciate our school board. So I just wanted to put that out. Scott?
Yeah, I think part of maybe what I need for this is that I come at this with my life experience and my view and my thought process, which might be vastly different than the other folks on the board. Okay. And I really value that because it makes me think, it makes me reconsider things or look at them through someone else's point of view, and it helps me understand. So perhaps having this at a work session, perhaps having this at a retreat would help. Certainly, I can only speak for myself. It would probably help me to understand other people's points of view better as we consider this policy and as we consider what it is and what it is not, and how it's to be used, and what is policy and what is procedure.
Okay. I think that makes sense. And I think we all we come to this board with our own experiences, and that's one of the great things about a board, is that we do all bring those different perspectives. But I think you're right, it's good to try to understand them and see where each other's coming from, especially in a policy like this that's very different from other policies. So I think that's a great point. So before we move on from this, are there any other last comments people would like to make on it? Otherwise, we'll work to figure out when and how this comes back to the board, and what that discussion will look like next time. Okay. So then the next policy for a second reading, which we can move this to approval if we desire, is policy 410 FMLA.
And we did have this policy reviewed by Kathy Moen, and she is on tonight if there are questions regarding FMLA, but this is her recommendation for the committee to move forward with.
Right. So are there any comments, any questions, clarifications that are needed on this policy? Right.
Hearing none, I move that it be advanced to an action item.
Second.
Okay. Does anyone have any comments on that? Any discussion? All right. All those in favor of moving this to an action item, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, same sign. Right. Motion carries. We will see this one again later. Next up is strategic planning update.
All right. Everybody see my screen? Awesome. Okay, so what I wanted to do really for the public is to share where we're at with strategic planning in terms of updating what we believe are the next steps, and share some of the conversations that the board has had. So I just have a couple slides. And so school board members, feel free to interject at will as we move along. But a couple of things. So in our school board discussions, as we've talked about this, and from our work session, we really came up with three kind of creating a sandbox of, we want to engage in a strategic planning process. That should be no surprise to anyone. That's been a conversation for a while. The second that most recently came up is, it probably makes sense to have someone facilitate this process as we move forward. And then if possible, can we complete a strategic planning process by the time we hit July 1? So those were the three big takeaways I had from our last discussion about strategic planning. So given those three things, I did some work with looking at different groups that do strategic planning, and one of those was TeamWorks, which is Dennis Cheeseborough, which people may remember. That's who the board is working with right now. We did our retreat with him as well, and it resonated with us because, one, we already have a relationship with the board and Dennis. The work that TeamWorks does really aligns with governance and management work, as you could hear in our last conversation, right? This whole kind of tension between what's governance, what's management, and we want to make it a good fit. One of the things that is different, unique about TeamWorks is they do strategic planning in a process called from the classroom to the boardroom, which is something where we are able to involve our staff from the very beginning and really try to build a strategic plan from what's working, what's not working, what do we want, and what don't we want in our classrooms, and really then try to have the board develop that vision, that process based on that with a staff input. That is not to say that we would not have input from other stakeholder groups. So that is where TeamWorks is the same as some others, where they ask for other stakeholders to provide input, such as our community. What does the community value? That came up tonight as well. What do we really want as a community in Hastings to be echoed in the strategic planning for the students that attend our schools? The other piece that then TeamWorks does that's a little bit different is there's this focus on a continual improvement process. So a lot of people who've been engaged in a strategic planning process that's more standard, you end up getting together and putting together this giant binder of sorts that has all of these things in it that we're going to do for the next 5 years. Ready, go. And this is a process that would give us a starting point that we would then revisit every year. And much like we do with long-term facility management planning, that 10-year plan, it's 10 years out, but we revisit it every year and we monitor for the next 10 years. And then we monitor for the next. This would get us on a cycle of doing strategic planning and every year annually coming back and saying, okay, so what for the next 36 months? What for the next 36 months? And adjust. So that the case, what the process looks like between now and July 1 is our school board chair puts together a subcommittee of 3 board members that would then meet with Dennis and myself to figure out for us in Hastings, what should a definite process and workflow timeline be like in order for us to get to that July 1 deadline. Then the school board has a work session on March 10th, which Dennis, I've already checked with him, is able to attend with us, where we can discuss and direct any details about that process and workflow timeline and come to some agreement on it. And then we would spend March 11th through May 31st getting that strategic plan completed. And so with that, I set this up as more of a discussion topic. I don't know if there are questions that board members have at this point, things that they'd want to point out to the public who's watching. But to recap, we're planning to finally start the strategic planning process with someone who the board's been working with and will hopefully get us a viable strategic planning and vision direction by the time we hit July 1st.
Right. So do we have any questions for Superintendent McDowell about this? I see you're unmuted, Lisa. Did you have something?
No, I didn't. I must have left myself unmuted. No, I'm happy to see that that July timeframe, and I think that'll serve us well because I suspect we're going to be in a situation of having to do budget adjustments shortly, sadly, and this will put us in a good position to do that.
So in talking about that subcommittee, just to keep the board in line, I guess, aware of my thinking, since we have board members who have served various amounts of time on the board, I was thinking it would be beneficial to have a range of tenure in the board members who are serving on the committee to bring different perspectives to kind of the timing and things like that. And so for a subcommittee, I don't know what we'd call this subcommittee, strategic planning subcommittee or committee, something.
It's going to be a short-term committee because it's just to get us organized with process and timeline.
Yep, it's just a quick ad hoc committee. And so Becky and Scott and myself would work on that timeline and try to get us started on this bigger process here. So, but yeah, short committee.
And then right now, again, just to recap, my plan is for that work session on the 10th of March for the whole board to be able to have that bigger discussion about, does the process feel right? Does the timeline feel right? What more information do we need? Dennis is able to join us for that, so he can help us work through that process. They're working with several districts right now, so even in Zoom or not Zoom, they've had some experience getting this to work for school districts, and so I'm confident they can do the same for us.
Okay. Any other questions? Otherwise, we'll be getting started here soon, which is very exciting. We've been talking about this for a long time, it seems. So. All right, so then we will move on to the administrative reports.
All right, well, this will be short tonight, but what I plan to do for the superintendent update is really give our public, for the most part, an update with where we are moving with regard to COVID and bringing our secondary students back into school. There's been a lot of discussion, and so I'm going to explain that here, and then after our board meeting tonight, there will be messaging that goes out to families and to our staff along the same line, so everybody has the information with regard to what direction we're planning to take here moving forward. So as everyone knows, it's been a very busy time since the governor made an announcement to changing what are the protocols and timeline for secondary going in. What that's caused us to do is have to dig a little deeper into what do we look at and expand the types of things that we look at in order to make a decent decision for our students, and when do we want to move students back in place. To begin with, what I'd like to make sure that our public is aware of is that when the governor changed secondary planning, what people typically heard was we needed to get students in person full-time all right away by the 8th, and that really wasn't his intent. The intent was to make sure that school districts had all of their students in some version of an in-person learning mode, which we have. So since January, we've had elementary back in person full time. As of this last Monday, we've had all of our students back in either in hybrid or in person. So from that standpoint, we're meeting the governor's expectations for schools. However, that said, it doesn't change the fact that we're all thinking about how do we get kids back into our buildings? How can we do it safely? How do we keep our staff safe? You know, that's really the question as you peel back the layers. And so after lots of conversation, lots of consideration, meeting with our staff of different buildings, meeting with our administrative team, our incident command team, talking one-on-one with our Dakota Health professionals, I've decided that we probably are in our best situation to push back moving in person to April 6th, which is the day we come back from spring break. And I'm going to share the reasons for that at this point in time. So one of the first reasons is because up to this point, all of the planning that we've done has been based on the guidance that we need to keep kids and staff at 6 feet distances, no matter what it is when we bring kids in. What changed with the governor's guidance is that was reduced to 3 feet. That presents some issues in our secondary buildings because the way some of our classrooms are set up, we can't guarantee right now 3 feet of distance for kids during the school day. And so in order for us to have enough time to go around and retool, and what I mean by that is we will be having building principals and teams going literally classroom to classroom, again, like we did this summer with tape measures, figuring out what furniture needs to come out of classrooms and where are we going to store that furniture so that we can rearrange classrooms to maintain 3 feet of distancing for our students. So that's the first reason. The second is that like other districts, March 26th is the last day of the 3rd quarter. So it's a natural transition break. The 26th, last day, we have spring break until the 5th. We come back and start 4th quarter on the 6th. Again, in addition to just those space constraints in classrooms, that extra week in spring break is going to give our custodians a last effort when there aren't kids in buildings and in classrooms to move large portions of furniture around, because if we remember, we're still in hybrid right now. It's not like it's summertime and we have empty buildings. We've got buildings every day that have kids and staff in them. People may not know this, but our vaccine schedule got kind of thrown off last week due to the storms that came through the south. But we are back on track, and thanks to the work of Kathy Moen and other staff, we've been able to offer all the secondary staff who wanted a vaccine at this point. And so what that means for us is we have to play the calendar game, because the Moderna vaccine is a 28-day spread. So if you think about that, start looking at calendars, this week is the same week 28 days from now that spring break, week before spring break. Why that impacts us is right now in hybrid, we can very easily cover our subs when we need them for staff to go get their vaccines internally, because of we don't have as many kids, and we can make those shifts. If we were in person, we wouldn't be able to do that. So fast forward to the week of the 26th, when our staff are going to be getting their 2nd doses. We need to be able to cover those classes while they get those doses. And in addition to that, there's more research that's come out this week that 2nd dose has a higher potential to have adverse effects on more people, but we can't predict that. So from a risk management standpoint, I'm not willing to take the risk that we're going to lose a large portion of our staff, and then we're going to be not able to have kids in class anyway. So we're better off having hybrid go through that week of the 22nd, be able to cover when staff need to be out, and at least keep kids in partially that way. And then in addition to that, the latest health experts are saying, be cautious. You know, lots of restrictions are being lifted right now. We don't know what the full impact of those restrictions is going to be. And we've taken time to this point. Let's continue to maintain that same type of processing. So our plan will be to, that week of the 22nd, we will have a flex day on that Wednesday, the 24th. We will have transition days for secondary on Thursday and Friday, the 25th and 26th, because that's still required when we make moves. And then spring break. And then we will plan to start full-time in-person learning for our secondary students on April 6th. So that's part 1. Part 2 is the big question of, okay, what does that look like? Well, it looks pretty much the same. Busing will stay on the same schedule. The time of day for school stays on the same schedule. Students will still be in block classes for those days. And the reason for that is we have to maintain that flexibility if we have to go back into hybrid or back into distance learning. We unfortunately in this, we've got to be able to shift on that dial back and forth. And so while we will have kids in every day, it won't be business as usual. There won't be 7 classes a day running at the high school. It'll be the same type of schedule we're running right now, but kids will all be in the buildings because we have to maintain cohorts. There's less transition then, and a ton more of our plexiglass throughout our buildings. So that's the update. And I don't, if there's questions, I'd be happy to answer questions. But again, this will be information that's laid out in written form, and it'll be going out tonight to all of our families and all of our staff as well. Yeah, Brian.
Brian?
Bob, could you just clarify for everyone what's going to happen with Wednesdays, which are currently flex days?
Good point. When we're in person, flex days will no longer exist. It'll be 5 days a week of school. So just like elementary, it'll mirror what we did in elementary. Once we shifted to full-time in person, then flex days go away. They would come back if we shifted back into hybrid.
All right, I see Brian has a follow-up. Does anyone have another question before Brian asks his second? All right, go for it, Brian.
Okay, thanks. I tried to pause, but I didn't see anybody raising their hand. Bob, also, I know that notes went out to all faculty and ISD staff asking them to seriously consider standing down on spring break vacations, especially ones that are outside the country, including Puerto Rico. Are we looking at doing some type of notice to the Hastings families, students and like, in terms of that same type of thing, in asking them to also stand down on those vacations, or seriously consider the quarantine situation when they return from those vacations coming back out of spring break? I hate for them to come into the building and 2 days later we're shut down again because a bunch of people went to Puerto Rico, Mexico, wherever, and showed up day one and set us back 3 months.
We could absolutely send something out. I guess I'd take direction from the board on that. I feel comfortable in making sure that our staff and the people that I'm responsible for are notified or put on notice that we need them to be as responsive as possible to that, knowing the impacts. But I'd want board direction to be sending stuff out like that to the community.
How does that, Chairman Waits, how does that look? How do we go about that? Does somebody make a motion for that? Do we talk about it in a different section?
We can talk about it here and see if there's a consensus for that and
Okay,
how the
I'm sorry,
board is
and I
feeling
think I cut
about it.
Becky off, so I apologize for that, Becky.
Becky?
I'm just a little indifferent on that because if you are traveling international right now, they're making you get tested before you come back into the country. I know you can get COVID traveling, even in the airplane. I've traveled outside the country, and so I'm a little indifferent, especially with the vaccinations coming. So I'm very indifferent on that. So sending that out. I mean, we can send it out to families, but they're still going to do.
You got muted, Becky.
Sorry, I'm on my son's computer. I don't know what I'm doing with his computer. I'm very indifferent on that. You know, we can send something out, but we can't stop anybody from doing that. You know, traveling outside the country, you are getting a COVID test. You know, that's the president's having us get tested coming back in. I don't know. I'm really indifferent on that.
Lisa?
I certainly appreciate both Brian and Becky's point. I would say, you know, given the experiences for the last year, and I know the superintendent from North St. Paul spoke about this. Right now, people can travel to Wisconsin in an evening and have dinner in a bar and come back. And that was true in non-mask mandated times in Wisconsin. If we communicate to families like, hey, we're having a plan and it's going to be on, you know, we're hybrid till this date and we're going to do this. I think the most that I would feel comfortable supporting is a generalized statement that says, you know, we all have to be, if we want to maintain all students in the building all days, we need to be in this together, which means everybody should seriously consider following CDC guidelines or Minnesota State health guidelines or something at the most. I would not be comfortable making a more directed statement than that.
Stephanie?
With their staff, it makes sense. Like you could say to staff, hey, this is the deal. You need to understand that this is how leave will be used should you get stuck on the wrong side of a border. This is, that's informational that can be used for planning. We don't have that same responsibility with students and families.
Stephanie?
I agree with Lisa. We and with Becky too, parents and families are going to do what they want to do, and there's no restrictions in that aspect. And there are, the CDC guidelines on what they can and can't do, and with getting tested as they come back into the U.S. It can't hurt to put out just an informational email saying, okay, if you're planning on going someplace, just be cognizant that if you test positive, and maybe saying that something to the fact of consider getting tested when you return from your vacation to ensure the safety of the schools and the students. And then reiterating as well that if somebody does test positive and we're back in session, what the implications are. The entire class will be out. I mean, my son is going through it right now, and he's been out of school for the last week and a half because of this. So there are implications to this, and we know it's going to happen. But if there are ways that we can mitigate it, and it doesn't hurt to put out a communication, an informational communication. I would fully support that.
Dave?
I would go with a friendly reminder, as what everybody has said, let your conscience be your guide a little bit, but knowing the ramifications if something goes wrong. I mean, all we can do is just remind folks that, hey, this could happen and we could be back in the soup again, just the time we get, everybody back in school. So a friendly reminder, I think, is about the best we can do.
So maybe it's something to
Scott?
tackle.
Oh.
Sorry, go ahead, Scott, sorry.
I'm the only one who hasn't said anything, so I feel like I better chime in on this. Realistically, if you're planning on traveling out of the country, your plans are made at this point. You aren't making plans 30 days before spring break to go out of the country. So that ship has sailed. At this point, we've all been in a pandemic state for the last year. If people have made up their minds how they're going to act one way or another. I don't know that anything that this board or the district says is going to change that. I have a hard time envisioning someone getting an email from the district and saying, oh my gosh, I hadn't considered that. I better not go. So to me, I understand the sentiment. I just think it's a bit of a moot point at this time.
Any other comments, questions, thoughts?
Maybe what we'll do is look at putting a reminder type thing in our Radar updates. I know I've started to add a link every week now to the testing sites, so that if people feel like they need to get tested, maybe we can just add an additional reminder of careful what you do type thing. It impacts all of us.
Because opening is the first step, staying open is the second step, and in order to stay open, we really need to be figuring out how to do this together.
I'd really like to have graduation in person this year.
That would be nice. It's goals.
Yeah, that's pretty important to me. So.
Okay. So then the next up on our reports is the building construction fund project update.
We had one project that's moving out of future and into design. That's the middle school partial roof replacement. There's going to be bids due on that here March 4th. And then the second project that we have bids due on early in March is the Kennedy and McCullough partial roof replacement. The bids are due on that one March 2nd. That's all I have.
Any questions? The bond, we're just getting to these last projects and getting through them. So it'll be exciting when it's all done. So student enrollment.
And the enrollment from last month, there was a slight decrease, so about 3 students. So for the most part, holding steady at this point. The only other thing I wanted to mention is that the district did send a survey out to families. So all resident students that are enrolled elsewhere received a survey from the district this week, just basically asking them what their plans are for next year so that we can start planning appropriately as we work on staffing for 21-22. So we're just starting to get those responses back in now, but it should be good information for planning purposes.
Great. So does this, I assume this includes kindergartners who are not currently in kindergarten right now?
Correct. If they would have been kindergartners last year and decided to hold back a year, they received that survey.
Okay, great. Any questions on this? Not seeing any. So we will move on to facility committee. So Lisa, would you like to give a summary?
Sure, I'll give a brief summary. The update for the bond projects we've already seen. We went through that at the committee. Kind of the bulk of the conversation at our committee was about transferring some projects, reviewing projects that can be transferred from contingency. Recommendations that we have are a little bit later in the agenda, but we are recommending 3 projects. A storage building at the middle school track, and high school tennis courts, that those projects be moved off of the contingency list and moved into action. And we discussed a 4th project at the high school baseball field, but we need to get some borings, not like borings, but soil borings in the spring, and do an evaluation of the drainage system. Thank you, Scott. At least I got one smile in the room. Thank you. So that might be considered in the future as a project that comes forward once we understand the scope. We only want to bring things forward out of facilities that the scope is well understood, including the costs. And then we heard from Superintendent McDowell that there's a space use committee that's been getting going with relevant and a diverse staff component to look at the next 3 to 5 years of preschool needs, space needs. And then in that mix is going to be the senior center space, ALC space, STARS, and just to start having that conversation as a whole. Our timeline on that committee has just been identified and getting started. The timeline is that our next facility committee meeting, which is later in April, will receive an update on their work and anticipate a recommendation in summer. I don't know when summer is. June, July, August kind of time frame.
Okay, are there any questions for Lisa or the facilities committee? Thank you for pulling together the summary. I'm not seeing any questions. All right, about finance committee.
think this is Scott.
Yep. So we talked, our primary task was to go through a list of assumptions that Jen Siebert had provided to us for the upcoming budgeting process. And we did so, and you'll see some of those later tonight as we continue through the meeting. So.
Are there any questions for Scott or the Finance Committee? Sounds like we'll be having some of that brought up later. So, all right, I'm not seeing any. So we will move on to the Policy Committee. So this is a long summary this time. Sorry, couldn't figure out. I'm never very good at bringing things down into the page limit. So we talked about the equity policy already at length tonight. And so that was, of course, brought up in our 2 policy committee meetings that we had in February. But we also talked about policy 421, which we just passed as the first reading tonight. And we also addressed policy 430 in our February 2nd meeting, and then that came back to the board at the work session. And policy 430 was staff recognition. And so that's not an MSBA policy, that is a district specific policy. And so Kathy Moen is actually, or has sent out already a survey to staff asking them how they would like to be recognized for their years of service. And so based off of that, we will again look at this policy. But that's where we're at right now with that. A couple policies we had talked about. Policy 613, which is graduation requirements. And when we first talked about this at the February 2nd meeting, the policy committee said, you know what, we want to take this on, we want to start talking about it. And one of the recommendations or discussion topics at that point was that when we address policy 613 for graduation requirements, that we would also look at potentially adding policy 620, which is credits for learning. And so, for example, one of those is if there's a way for students to get physical education credits without being in a PE class, something like that. And so we saw those 2 as being related and something that we would kind of look at together. When we came back to this policy on the 16th of February, we spoke with Jen Reichel. So for the community, she's the Director of Teaching and Learning. And so after consideration and discussion, there's going to be a lot that goes into the graduation requirements, that it is beyond the policy committee to make this decision, but that we would want to hear from the community members, that they should have a say in kind of graduation requirements if they have thoughts on it, working with teachers, administrators, and kind of pulling that group together to have a broader discussion about this within the district, more than just policy committee. And so we said that we would put these 2 on hold as kind of a priority as soon as that strategic plan is completed, so that then we have our board guidance to then be working with the other stakeholders on how we address this policy and which direction we want to go. And then the last bit is just that next up to review is going to be looking at that kindergarten age policy. So along with these other policies we're still working on, we're also going to bring kindergarten into the mix. So are there any questions for policy? Lisa?
This just speaks to the point that was brought up earlier, that I brought up earlier around equity, that getting into the work on the graduation policy, and I would agree, graduation requirements is pinching us right now. It's driving some decisions, I believe, both with individual students and in many ways restricting the choices that AVID students have. I mean, as it links into equity, people in AVID are having constrained options. and it pinches us in budget adjustment periods. So as a pro-process person, I get it, you know, let's do the strategic plan, but I don't want to lollygag. I want to have the team identified. I want to be diving into this, and have this work get going, because it also has a really long tail. Like implementation has a tail. Should anything shift from current, you know, it doesn't start like right now. You don't apply it to the kids that are currently seniors, you know, whatever current period is, if it passes or changes. So it's got this really long tail, and I'm just uncomfortable with us letting that be too long when it comes to some of these both equity and budget decisions. So
Absolutely. I think that's a great point. And I mean, policy committee can talk at our next meeting about if we want to start getting all these pieces in place so that once the strategic plan is done, we really are we're ready to hit the ground running, and we have that committee figured out, and we have all these steps figured out, that we can talk about that and how we want to get this started.
thank you for considering that. Thank you.
Any other questions, comments, curiosities? All right, seeing none, we will move on to self-funded insurance. I think this is the most committee summaries we've had in a while.
Good
Finally,
evening.
the spotlight comes off a policy and somebody else is doing something.
Good evening. I'm going to provide you the update on the insurance committee meeting. We had our last meeting on last Wednesday on February 17th. During that meeting, we reviewed information related to an RFP that was completed related to our pharmacy benefits manager. We reviewed renewal information for our medical insurance plan. We reviewed renewal information for our dental plan, and we also looked at options for plan design changes at the request of committee members. We reviewed our claims information and reserve balances. And this evening, when we get to action items, I will be presenting information for you for board approval related to all three of these, the medical, the dental, and the pharmacy benefits plan. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
All right, are there any questions?
And Kathy, this may come up in the next discussion. I know we came out of the committee discussion with a lot of good information and a very strong trend. And then I know there was sort of an email touchback with committee members to make sure that the trend had been properly assessed. Did you get any feedback on that other than or positive, or people were like, yep, we're clearly going?
No, I sent an email, provided the documents that were provided to the board, and asked that if there was any questions or concerns that people contact me. I have not heard from anybody from the committee.
Okay. Just as a person that listened into that committee meeting, that the recommendations or the direction was clear. Sorry, I'm supposed to be submitting names for the hockey game now. Do that later. But okay, good. Thanks. Just wanted to confirm that there hadn't been any reservations.
No, nothing that I received.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any other questions? All right, seeing none, we will move into our action items for the night. First up is our consent agenda, which includes a couple of contracts, personnel report, bills payable, etc. All of those documents can be found in Board Book if you're curious to read them. So, do we have a motion to approve the consent agenda?
So move.
Second.
Okay. Is there any discussion? All right, all those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed, same sign. Sorry, I was a little fast there. Okay, motion carries. All right, items for individual action. We will start with the internet upgrade project.
Yeah, so I can take this one, and I'm sure if I mess anything up, Jen Subert will jump to my rescue. But the reason this is in there is you may or may not be aware that part of the bonding project is continually upgrading our infrastructure, and part of that infrastructure is our connection or switches in our building, as well as our access points. So those are the access points, are those things in the ceiling as you walk through our buildings that you can see. Same thing as your house, like a router, but it creates that seamless Wi-Fi throughout our buildings. And so we have 4 buildings on the docket here, the high school and the 3 elementary schools, that need replacement of both switches and access points. And so it's a relatively large project. It is part of our bond, comes in at about a little over $809,000. Missy was able to do a bidding process for this and came back with a recommendation. And so we are here to make that recommendation that we move forward with the bid. The company can get it done for us starting this summer. And so we're pretty confident that this will be a good thing for us moving forward.
Okay. Do we have any questions? Lisa?
Just a quick question. I'm desperately going back, not desperately, I'm quickly going backwards in board book and trying to look at what our budgeted item was for this, what the budget amount was for this. Are we in the ballpark? It's in a font size now I can't read. So
There's Missy.
Is that a problem? But hi, Missy.
I'm on too, just in case there were questions. I don't know that there was ever a budgeted amount for it because it was part of the tech bond. So we hadn't individualized cost items when we had done the tech bond, but it definitely fits within the amounts that we have remaining in there. And then one other important thing to add is that with the whole project, we've gone through the E-rate process, which means of that 800,000, we'll actually end up getting 60% of that back. So in terms of actual cost for us that comes out of the bond, it will be reduced by 60% of the amounts that you're seeing on there. And we did do, middle school was also on there as part of that project that we had planned to do, and we completed that last summer.
Okay, so now I'm just gonna expose my ignorance. Is the tech bond different than the big building bond?
Nope.
Okay, thank you.
So Lisa, on the.
But that being true, is it on the building construction fund table?
Yep. So if you go down to other district projects, there's technology improvements.
Oh,
and
yeah, yeah.
Now there's a balance of about 771,000. So once we receive the E-rate funds back, we'll be well within that amount.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the clarification.
Thanks for popping on, Missy.
Yep.
And Jen.
All right, any other questions? We have Missy here, so. I like coupons, 60% off through the E-rate process sounds fantastic. So thank you for all of your work on that.
I have one question. Maybe it was already said and I just missed it, but when would this actually happen? When would the upgrades happen?
With the E-rate process, the soonest we would be able to start is July 1st. They've got a timeline that we need to work within. So they would actually start the installation after July 1st. They would have the items ready to go before then, so we could start getting into the buildings right away after July 1st. We would complete as much as we could in the summer, but because it's so many buildings, we don't know yet if we are going to be able to get into all of the buildings over the summer. So it's possible that some of them, particularly maybe like one of the elementary schools, might end up being done over like partially MEA break or over the holiday break next winter. So we're still kind of working out the timeline, but it would start July 1st and then would go through it could go through the end of June, just depending on when we can get into the buildings, because we will have internet down at the time that we're working in the buildings. And the 3 elementary projects are a little bit more extensive than the high school because there also is some cabling work that needs to be done. So they're going to need to get in and do a little bit more work there versus the high school where it's more just some installs of access points and switches.
Awesome, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I got a munchkin. A good night hug. Okay. All right. Any other questions? All right, then we will move on to the student trip moratorium, which we're going to get some explanation on this because that title sounds scary. Bob,
I need to vote on that.
Superintendent.
I think that's an action item.
Oh, yes, we do. I'm sorry. My child completely confused me. We're good. All right. Do we have a motion?
Yeah, I would move to accept or to go forward with the tech work at the 4 sites, the internet upgrade project.
Second.
Is there any discussion? All right, seeing none. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, same sign. All right, motion carries. Thank you, Lisa, for bringing me back a step. All right, so now we will go into the student trip moratorium.
Sure. We talked about this at our last meeting as well, and so I'm bringing it here as a board action item. Essentially, this is we're asking for a motion that relates to the conversation, which would be to suspend all out-of-state domestic student travel and trips through August of 21, so August of this year, international travel field trips through August of 22. All domestic field trip plans beginning September 21 must have a COVID mitigation plan. Domestic and international trips will be revisited as a board discussion topic at the August 21 business meeting. So the only thing that I want to clarify on this is there was a little bit of confusion with the term domestic, and I just need the board to clarify whether by domestic we mean contiguous United States, or does it mean that a group could travel to Hawaii or Puerto Rico, because those are technically domestic. So I do need that clarity because I've already gotten requests surrounding that. So that's what we're talking about.
Right, thank you. So who would like to start? Brian?
From my perspective, I might be swayed, but I'm thinking that anything that leaves the contiguous United States might as well be international. You're crossing oceans and things like that, you've left the country. I know there's Commonwealths and all those pieces of like that, but I consider Puerto Rico especially to be, yes, it's a Commonwealth, but it's not even a state. That's leaving the country. That's international travel for the purposes of what we're trying to do.
Any other thoughts from board members?
Trying to
Lisa?
understand the question that you've received, Bob, and I do have one other thought. But so that question being asked is about that period of time between August of.
So for the time that we have said no, for the question that we have said no international travel, so from August 2021 through August 2022, during that time, are we still okay with trips to any of the 50 states and or territories, such as Puerto Rico or Hawaii, or are we talking about wanting them to stay in the contiguous United States? So when we originally had this discussion as a board, we mentioned wanting parents to be able to, you could have a backup, right? You could drive, you could get there to pick up a kiddo. And so, but technically Hawaii and Puerto Rico are part of the United States, but are we considering them essentially non-travel to those? Dave?
I guess I thought when we were discussing this that if you couldn't drive there, we wanted it set up so that if there was an issue and we needed parent involvement, that there could be a transport you could drive there. You could get to that point from point A to point B. And I agree that flying to Hawaii, Alaska, Virgin Islands, Dominican, whatever, someplace that takes us out of the 48 contiguous states is a problem. And I think we should stay with just in the 48 states.
Becky?
I just have a question. When you fly to Hawaii, do you go through customs? Do you go in, are you treated like it's an international?
Depends on how you
No.
fly.
Yeah, I don't think so. If you've departed from the United States and you're arriving in Hawaii, I don't think that you go through customs.
And in Puerto Rico, it's just a one straight, like a domestic?
Trying to think when we went to Puerto Rico, if we went through customs.
I was on a cruise ship and I think we did, but I don't, because we were on a
Yeah,
cruise ship.
I think we did go through customs with Puerto Rico.
So
I
for Puerto Rico, U.S. citizens do not need a passport to get to Puerto Rico. Brian?
I think the point here is that passport or no, the point is if someone gets stuck somewhere because something happens, they can't get back in a car or a bus. They'd have to find a way to fly back. So if for some reason they ground planes or whatever, you're stuck in those places. There's no way you're getting back. You can't, because if you can't fly, you're stuck, right? I mean, because there's water separating you from the mainland. So I think that's the point, and I think that's the point Dave was trying to make, is why we discussed this, and said it had to be somewhere that was drivable, which leads us with the 48 contiguous.
Yeah,
Lisa?
go ahead.
My recollection of the conversation, and it was around the time that you had to get a negative test to get back on a flight for international. That's when you would get stuck there, is if you couldn't get your test or you got a positive test. Nobody knows what restrictions are going to show up around domestic travel, but right now, whether you fly to Phoenix or you fly to Hawaii, you're treated the same on both ends. I mean, unless a state does some sort of lockdown. I mean, I think that might be part of the mitigation plan. I could see accepting travel to states. I would not feel as comfortable with travel to Commonwealths. And I want to be clear whenever this motion goes forward that should we have like a student, and I don't know how to do this, maybe this is not possible, but like if the baseball team is going to go play in Hudson or has an opportunity to play in Hudson, that's out of state travel. And do we just say that that's not, you can't do it? You can't, I mean, I could see not going to play in a tournament in Nebraska, but I mean, if we're going to get into eaches, I didn't think of that till right now.
Scott, did you have something to add?
Just, I guess when I can appreciate the point, I guess my leaning would be that it is the contiguous 48. But I can certainly see other points of view on this one. I think that from a planning standpoint, us revisiting it in August of 21 is not going to help anything in 2022 from that standpoint.
No, not any place that you have to fly.
Right.
It'd be that, like the show choir example.
Right. Which is what is giving me pause.
Yeah. I'm all about being on the side of caution and it's contiguous United States travel. But I'm willing to accept that for this time frame.
And revisit in August?
Yeah, but I mean, the reality is we're going to revisit it when we have to revisit it.
Right.
But I think it's fine to be intentional about revisiting it at the end of the summer as we go into the next year.
Okay.
And
Yeah, I
then
get-
where did 2022 come about, for a whole year for international? Just because, or where did that number come from?
The reason for the length of time there was because it creates so much there's so much planning that goes into those trips, that if I remember the conversation correctly, it was simply saying we want to be on the side of caution all the way through next school year with regard to this, and let people know so that they don't inadvertently plan to take a trip during that time with kids and then not be able to do it and not get their money back.
Brian?
Just to help you out, Becky, I can tell you from just the personal experience, the planning on the international trips literally is over a year out. The fundraising starts so far in advance that they could go through all those hoops and all that work and start making their payments, get past the deadline for getting all their money back, and the whole thing could blow up. It's just hard to say because it's such a long window ahead of time.
Thank you for the clarification. Makes sense.
All right. Are there any other questions? Otherwise, oh, Brian, you're muted.
I'm sorry, I almost forgot. I don't know if this comes under this piece we're discussing now, but I do know that there's a trip out there that has a July 1st deadline, and after that date, they can't get more. They'll lose $100 up to July 1st, but after that, they will lose far more. And it's a rollover from last year when they couldn't go, so it's still out there. So I don't know what we do with that, because by October, they may very well be able to take that trip. I don't know if we advise parents to get travel insurance and we say you keep going, or I don't know what to do with it. But I think we have to give them some sort of answer so they can figure out what they do. It's a Boston trip. And I think we need to try to give them some guidance, because July 1st is their cutoff, and then they'll start losing money. And this is, like, again, it's a holdover from last fall.
But the trip is scheduled for October?
Correct.
Okay. So this would allow that, because domestic travel can begin September 1st, 2021 is what we have set up in this.
I would only advise that those parents get travel insurance, just in case. But it's great if they can go. Thanks, Kelsey.
Mhm. So otherwise, and please correct me if you disagree, what I'm hearing from the board is that when we say domestic, we are meaning the contiguous United States. Okay? That is official clarification of nodding of heads. All right, with that, do we have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second.
And is there any more discussion? Right, all those in favor say aye. Oh, Lisa?
Again, just back to the activities point, and I'm fine with this being the case, that we want to be clear that this includes sports teams going out of state for a singular event, even if it's not overnight. Are people generally comfortable with that? I don't know that anything's scheduled. I haven't looked at the spring calendar at all. But I
Lisa,
know
just
it's
out of
legal.
curiosity, I'm just curious, in case you have some information that maybe we don't, how often are our teams traveling across state lines?
Well, I don't have any information that you don't have. I just
Okay,
know that
that's fair.
I just know that in hockey, at a minimum, and I know it's true in youth baseball, is Hudson, Red Wings in Minnesota, River Falls. Occasionally, those teams will have contests with them. I don't know that we ever go there in high school.
So I'm reading this as international travel and field trips is the way that it's worded.
Well, it says, the first sentence says to suspend all out-of-state domestic student travel and field trips through August. That's the first sentence.
So I think it's missing the word international travel in that first sentence. It should have it.
Well, I thought we were saying that maybe. I thought we were saying nobody travels anywhere through the summer. Was that my understanding?
I had that same understanding that no one would travel.
That was
through
my
the end of-
understanding.
No one travels, period. You're not crossing the Wisconsin border, the Iowa border.
Yeah, and it just for the summer, just for spring and summer. So this kind of gives marching band a sense of what the constraints are. This gives early fall activities maybe a sense of what the constraints are. And I'm comfortable with that. I just want to make sure that we're all clear about what this might entail.
Clarification.
Do we have any idea if there are sports activities planned for out of state?
No, I have no idea.
I don't either. Typically the high school teams, everything they do, generally speaking, is within the state of Minnesota. The only ones that could be a factor in that, band may travel out of state during the summer. I don't know if they do or not. I'd have to get some help with that. And, show choir, but they're not till their season is way off. I mean, they don't start their season until 2022 at this point, their next season. So that's moot. But band might. That's the only one I can think of that travels out of state.
I know band is looking at the band thing in Gustavus, so it wouldn't be.
Oh, that's in state though.
Yeah.
But they do have parade season, and they have marched in nearby out-of-state parades. So I don't know that they have that on the schedule for this year. That would be a question for Emily Chandler, but
Or if there's a parade season anywhere this year yet?
correct.
Okay. So the understanding of the board is that this does include sports trips. Nodding
Or
heads.
activity trips.
Okay. Yep. Any other discussion before we take a vote? Okay. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Oppose, same sign. Motion carries. Next up is the high school tennis courts, middle school track, and middle school storage building.
So we have lots of people on for this one tonight that can speak to it. I don't know who. We've got, Lisa alluded to it earlier, but the facilities committee is bringing forward more bond work to shift. And so we're looking at the high school tennis courts, the track at the middle school, and the additional storage building that would be located on the south end of the middle school, right by the track there. So I don't know, Lisa, if you want more specific than that.
No, I don't need anything more specific. I'd be happy to answer questions. And I'm just gonna say right now, my mouse froze up, so I will not be unmuted. I will not be muted until that chooses to unfreeze itself. I'm not trying to say anything.
If you're on a PC or a Mac, you can do Alt A, and that toggles mute, not
Yeah.
mute.
Okay.
But at any rate, my question is, the middle school storage building, it was my understanding that the driver behind that was to get out of the shared space that we have with, I believe it's Public Works, which is just on 15th, or on Pine Street. On Pine Street, down the hill, so towards Highway 55. Is that still the plan, or what is the impetus to now we need a building? That was my thought, and I haven't heard anything about the Public Works building that we've been sharing.
Sure. So it's a both and. It's not an either or. So right now we don't have an intention to not be in the lease with the Public Works building, but what the Public Works building does not get us is the ability to store our implements in a protected space. So if you ever drive down the road between the district office and that building, you'll see all the attachments and everything outside in the weather and all of that. This building is intended to be a cold storage building so that we can keep all of our implements protected and inside when they're not being used. While at the same time utilizing, I believe we have about 40% of the space, something like that, in the shared building.
So does that then mean that the powering units for those implements will be stored in the same building? So if it's a John Deere subcompact, compact tractor that, okay, I've got the blade, I've got the front blade for pushing snow, I've got the rear blade for grade, all that stuff, and the tractor is all in one spot. I guess I'm just making sure that they're not going to be tracking from one building to the other, because that's not exactly a short distance.
So the short answer is no, they'll still need 2 spots, but that's why the location at the middle school is so that it's close for them to be able to get those implements.
Okay.
Dave?
Scott, part of that, maybe, do you remember when we were looking at the shed down at Todd Field and the stuff that was stored in there before we started construction? And some of that had to come out and be moved, and that kind of added to the necessary need to have some additional storage, cold storage someplace else, because after the change over and putting in the turf and some of the things that I don't remember if you'd seen those pictures that I had passed around that
Yeah, I'm not remembering them directly, but I presume there was regular grass, implements and,
right.
A striping tool and, whatever you needed to take care of the grass field and whatever you needed to take care of the irrigation system and things such as that. I'm sure there was, I can understand that there was various implements there, and now those have gone somewhere else and that space has been repurposed with now the tools that we need to maintain the turf. Right? Is that?
Yep,
yeah.
That's
okay.
correct.
All right.
I had also heard a different location for this building at one point. I'm trying to think where. I mean, I like this location better, but I thought there was a different location that had been proposed.
Part of that discussion came along with, okay, where is it access? What's the drivability? Do we have a tar road that we could get to right there?
Right.
Some of those generic things, and also, does it fit within a security camera's view?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's why I say I like this location much better. Do we lose parking then on the south side of the auditorium?
No, I think the current spot is actually on the grass.
Right.
Mhm.
The grass, but not quite on the soccer field. There's kind of that space in there. Yeah, and I'm not sure the other location got so far as being proposed. It was a placeholder, maybe more than anything
Yeah,
else.
I think it was just a brainstorming idea more
Yeah,
than
like
anything.
Like this is the thing we're gonna need, and it's gonna take about this much room, and here's a spot. And then when they really dug into it, I think more consideration was given to multiple locations near the middle school, and by that turn close to the other storage facility, and that's when it got really serious about evaluating sites. But to the broader question here, these 3 items were relatively high on, they were kind of the next group of items on our list of projects. They're well within our available contingency. They're not gonna, it's improbable, very improbable that this would grow out of our ability to fund them. And we talked as a facility committee about, if we do want to prioritize if we have an existing facility like the high school tennis courts and the middle school track, that we would try and prioritize maintaining it, because once you push maintaining it off too far, you pretty much don't have it again. And the cost of replacement, should you ever want to do it, is really high. So that is where some of these come from next, is maintaining existing facilities that we can afford.
Okay, are there any other questions? All right, I don't see any. So what we can do is take a motion to move these into the bond project.
So move.
Second.
All right, is there any more discussion? All those in favor say aye.
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 Aye. Opposed, same sign. All right, motion carries. Next up is the initial 2021-2022 budget assumptions.
Jen, you want to take that?
Sure. I can just review with you what I covered at the Finance Committee meeting. So that was last week, February 16th, and we walked through these budget adjustments and really, or I'm sorry, the budget assumptions. Really, it's the initial starting budget will be based on these, but there may be changes as additional information becomes available. So I'll kind of speak to that as I go through some of them. And the initial budget will be used by the board for planning purposes, and just kind of keeping in mind that updates will be made as we go through. So I'll share my screen. Okay. So the first one is the enrollment. So we're looking at going from 4,183 and the enrollment will be that 4,183, which is a reduction of 38 approximately from the 2021 revised budget. And this is one of them where, you know, it's based on the best information we have available at the time. So we have a projection model that we use that has multiple different projection methods. And then what I did is added back in 50% of the students that transferred out this year into non-public and other public schools. And then I added back in 90% of the kindergartners that were held back. So, you know, we're making an assumption that we're going to get some of those kids back. This is one where that survey is going to help us refine this information. So once those results all are in, I may make an update to this enrollment number depending on what we're hearing from families. The next one is special education revenue. And this is one where, you know, for 2021, we're still using an estimate. We won't find out that final number until the fall. So what we do on this one is kind of look at trend and historical data. We know that there should be a slight growth in the formula. So I put it at $6.1 million approximately, and that's an increase of 2% from 2021. And this is one where, I mean, it's such a big dollar amount that I do have our auditor review it too, just to make sure that it's something that they're comfortable with. So I've already done that. The next one is compensatory revenue. So compensatory revenue is based on your fall free and reduced count. And this year, with meals being free for all kids, it was really difficult for districts to get families to complete the free and reduced applications. So we, as a district, are not alone in this, but pretty much every district is anticipating a reduction in that compensatory revenue. So right now, based on the fall free and reduced count, we'd have a reduction of about 177,000 in compensatory revenue. The next one is the high school parking fees. So for 2021, we didn't collect parking fees, mostly because of the busing situation, and we've asked families or students to drive themselves whenever possible. But for 21-22, we'll be looking to add back those fees in the amount of $102,000. The staffing allocations, so I have them listed here by grade. But basically, you know, the staffing allocations will be done based on these numbers. The one kind of little refinement that we did is when we went through the budget adjustments process, these weren't whole numbers or rounded numbers. So as the finance committee, we talked about that, and it makes it a lot easier, I guess, to do those allocations based on whole numbers. So the committee was okay with making that slight adjustment. The other thing is that we know that we're adding the Hastings Online Academy next year for grades 5 through 12, but that is with the intent of still sustaining these same ratios. It should be cost neutral. The next item is workers' comp. This one we're looking at a small increase, 2%. It's about $3,700, not anything major there. The next one is all the electricity and utilities. So you can see electricity, I have a 5% increase. Natural gas, it ranges, so we're putting a 20%. Refuse removal or garbage is 15%. Water and sewage, 8%. So the total increase with all of those is about $82,000 to our budget. The next item is property and liability insurance, and we're with MIST, or the Minnesota Insurance Scholastic Trust Program. And for the past several years, we've had smaller increases, and then for 2021, it was a pretty significant increase. So I took like a 5-year average on this, and it's putting us at that 27%. So it's a $71,000 increase. We should be hearing more about that here soon. I reached out just this week, and they said hopefully by next week we'll have some preliminary numbers. Health insurance, we're using a 0% increase, and that we'll kind of cover in more detail, I think, in the next action item for the health and dental insurance renewals. The transportation contract, right now we've got a 3.25% increase, which is approximately $125,000 addition to the budget. And then the last one that, you know, is really the big one is the general ed revenue formula allowance. So we don't know yet what will be approved, but as the committee decided to use a 1% in year 1 and also a 1% in year 2. So then the only other one that I haven't touched on is teacher negotiations, and we'll continue to work through that in the closed session tonight. So I'm happy to take any questions.
All right, Lisa?
Yeah, I don't have a question, but I want people to understand that bottom bullet, the general education review formula. So that's revenue formula. So that's what the state legislature is working on right now, right? Like how much are we going to get from the state? And there's everything on the table from a 0.5. Well, somebody's probably got 0 on the table, but a 0.5 up to a 2 with 2 forever with inflation. Nobody knows where that's going to land. But with the intent of the committee, and correct me if I'm wrong, Scott, is for planning purposes, we'd use 1% in year 1 and 1% in year 2, which is roughly $300,000. Is that right, Jen?
Year 1, yep.
Year 1. And then year 2, it's $300,000 plus $300,000. So this is where 1 plus 1 equals 3. That's roughly $1 million. And the intent of the committee was we're going to make this commitment, and if this does not come through from the state, we would anticipate withdrawing this from our unfunded or our reserve from the fund balance, because we're not going to make this plan and then have the state come in lower and then go into some crisis budget adjustment immediately prior to the school year. So this is a commitment essentially that even if we don't get it from the state, we're putting that extra into the budget.
I cannot correct you because you are spot on.
Thank you for that clarification a bit. And who knows what the state will pass, if the state will pass anything, or if I anticipate it'll be a special session or two. So are there any questions about this? Not seeing any. So with that, do we have a motion to approve the initial budget assumptions?
So moved.
Second.
Second.
Any other discussion? All right. All those in favor say aye.
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 Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Last up for items of individual action is the health and dental insurance renewal.
Good evening again. This evening, we are requesting board approval of the rates and the plan design changes for our medical and dental plans, as well as a change in our pharmacy benefits manager, or the PBM. As Jen shared, for our medical insurance, we are requesting an approval of a 0% increase to our rates. And this recommendation comes in combination with a change in the pharmacy benefits manager, which we are anticipating will play a key role in helping us manage pharmacy use and avoid claims cost against our plan in the amount of approximately $400,000. We are also requesting approval of a 0% increase to our dental plan. The insurance committee, after considering our plan reserve and reviewing our current benefits, is also recommending 2 plan design changes. One includes eliminating the deductible for our in-network provider, and the other provides for an increased allotment towards implants for our employees to have a full coverage up to the copay amount. So with that, we are requesting approval, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have.
All right, are there any questions?
Lisa, do you want me to touch on the timelines a little bit about moving it up?
No, I think
Okay.
if we didn't get any response to the request, I'm comfortable.
Okay.
I think that's fine.
All right, I'm not seeing any questions. So do we have a motion to approve?
So moved. And I will second it.
Okay, is there any more discussion? Okay, all those in favor say aye.
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 Aye. Opposed, same sign. All right, motion carries. I apologize, we do need to come back to policy 410 for approval as well. Board book is not giving me that reload your meeting, so it didn't pop up. So policy 410 was the FMLA. So do we have a motion to approve policy 410?
So moved.
Is there any discussion? All those in favor of approving FMLA policy, say aye.
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 Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion carries. So with that, our future meetings are also listed on here. So we have policy committee meeting, board work session, and a regular board meeting coming up in March. All right, and so at this point, we would like to go into a closed meeting to discuss negotiations. And so if there is a motion to adjourn to a closed meeting.
So move.
Second.
Okay, any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
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 Aye. Opposed, same sign. All right, then we are adjourned to a closed meeting. So do we have a motion to adjourn?
I'll rephrase it. Motion to adjourn.
Second.
All right, any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
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 Aye. Opposed, same sign. All right, the meeting is adjourned.